most of us, most Americans, even American Jews, who think they know a lot about the Holocaust. We've all read our certain amount of books and seen movies and documentary films. But still, I think it's fair to say the principal image we have of the Holocaust, the first thing that comes to mind is the fate of families like Anne Frank's family. Living in Holland, living in a country occupied by the Germans. Within a short time, the Jews are identified. Perhaps if there's a certain amount of time, they're made to wear yellow stars, either as badges or as armbands. And then the Germans assemble them in various places in the country, in the capital cities, put them on trains, send them to Poland, where they're murdered. And this is, of course, the fate of hundreds of thousands, millions in Western Europe, Central Europe, Poland. But that image does not cover the full story. Because in German-occupied Soviet territory, generally speaking, it was not the case that the victims were rounded up and sent to the killers, as happened in Western Europe, Central Europe. In German-occupied Soviet territory, the killers descended upon the victims, like locusts on a field, and carried out massacres, open-air massacres, near the towns and cities and even shtetls where these Jews were living. And that's the principal difference between what happens in Western Europe and Central Europe and what happened in German-occupied Soviet Union. Another thing to bear in mind, when we think of the 6 million, we should keep in mind that we now believe that of that number of people, about 2.5 million were living in German-occupied Soviet territory at the time they were killed, which is extremely high proportion of all the victims. So when I speak about German-occupied Soviet territory, I mean the territory of the Soviet Union on June 22nd, 1941, when the Wehrmacht invaded. That includes Soviet territory as of 1939, and then the Baltic states that were incorporated in 1940, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, that had been independent countries after World War I. We're talking about Eastern Poland, which the Soviet Union invaded when the Germans invaded in September of 1939. Those had large Jewish communities. And a part of Romania that was ceded to Stalin's Russia, called Bessarabia, also had sizable Jewish communities. So on the eve of the German invasion in June of 1941, the population of the Soviet Union was 5.5 million Jews. And by the time of the height of the German occupation over the winter of 1942-1943, when they reached the Volga, they occupied an area that contained about 4 million of the 5.5 million Jews. And all those 4 million were, of course, immediately vulnerable. That's the context. That defines what I'll be speaking about this afternoon. Hitler's intentions were not immediately clear to everyone, perhaps even to the Germans themselves. Certainly throughout those years, 1933, when Hitler came to power, and the invasion of Poland in 1939, there was a gradual escalation in attacks on German Jews. Exclusion from civil society, the Nuremberg laws, and the physical attacks associated with Kristallnacht in November of 1938. Not only the physical attacks on Jewish neighborhoods and synagogues, but thousands were actually thrown out of the country and dumped over the border into Poland. And even after the invasion of Poland in 1939, the Warsaw Ghetto was established, another very large ghetto in Lodz was established. We believe that between 1939 and 1941, about 50,000 Jews perished in Poland. Random shooting, exposure, starvation. But this was not yet systematic mass murder. And if you pardon the expression, it was small change compared to what the Germans proved capable of. There were even thoughts, once they were in Poland and they were invading a country with a total Jewish population of 3 million, that, oh well, we'll conquer France, we'll conquer Britain, we'll rule the seas, we'll send the Jews to Madagascar. That was actually seriously considered. No one can say how seriously considered, but it was considered. We'll just send the Jews to this French colony off the coast of Africa. There was an idea to move the Jews to a reservation area they call near Lublin. That would be a Jewish reservation. Again, separating the Jews, but not mass murder. But after the invasion of the Soviet Union in the spring and the summer of 1941, this is when the systematic killing begins. Over the winter of 1940-1941, Hitler and the General High Command begin making their plans for Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. And by the spring, they've assembled four shooting units, the Einsatzgruppen, which is about 3,000 soldiers, who are trained to carry out killings of 3 categories of people once they invade Soviet territory. They will follow the Wehrmacht into Soviet territory. They will find commissars, who are Communist Party officials attached to Red Army units to ensure political loyalty. They will find saboteurs. A saboteur, in their eyes, is anyone, a civilian, who is seen to be resisting the German occupation. You look at them cross-eyed, you're a saboteur. You throw a stone, you're a saboteur. Maybe you plant some dynamite on a railroad track, of course, you're a saboteur. You're killed. And Jews. These 3 categories of people will be placed outside of the law. Hitler also made clear to the army that the Geneva Conventions would not apply. The Geneva Conventions applied on the Western Front. French soldiers that were captured, British soldiers that were captured. We've heard a lot about the Geneva Conventions in our country this past decade. So it's worth remembering that on the Eastern Front, Hitler made clear that the Geneva Conventions would not apply. Now, in spite of the fact that Stalin was given very concrete warnings from his intelligence services that the Germans were going to mount an attack in June, even on the specific date, Stalin disregarded these warnings. He wanted to show Hitler that he could be a reliable ally and not engage in any kind of provocation that could form a pretext for the Germans to invade. But by signing the Non-Aggression Pact at the end of August 1939, Stalin made a strategic blunder of immense proportions. He created a common border between Germany and the Soviet Union. When you look at a map, you see that there's this country, Poland, and Czechoslovakia, that lie between Germany and the Soviet Union, even the borders of 1941. But by signing the pact, there's now a common border. There's no longer a buffer. So it's astonishing to understand this today, given satellite technology and other means of surveillance from the skies, that the Germans could assemble the largest army in history, millions of men, material, planes, tanks, armor divisions, and still invade and take the Soviets by surprise. The scale of the fighting was unimaginable. The scale of the carnage was unimaginable. Millions of Soviet soldiers were killed or captured in the first months after the invasion. Cities like Vilna, Riga, Minsk were immediately captured within weeks after the invasion. The siege of Leningrad begins on September 8th, barely 3 months after the invasion. So Soviet defenses virtually collapsed. Moscow was threatened so much by October that the diplomatic corps, cultural officials, and parts of the government are evacuated deeper into the country. This is, of course, the Soviet Union, the largest landmass in the world, to Kuibyshev, hundreds of miles to the east. And Moscow was only saved in December when the Germans are turned back. That's the first serious German defeat, Soviet victory, right around the time of Pearl Harbor. So that's the scale of these first 6 months. As soon as the Wehrmacht is capturing territory, these German army units are followed by units of Einsatzgruppen, German order police, and a special battalion of soldiers assembled under Himmler's personal command. Initially, the massacres involved the men they find, the Jewish men they find. They spared the women and children. But by August, the massacres include all Jewish men, women, and children they can identify. The Germans capture Kiev on September 19th. Within 8 or 9 days, this is a typical action, the Germans put signs up around the city that all the Jews must assemble at a certain street corner. They're allowed to bring, if I remember correctly, 5 kilograms of material, of personal possessions, clothing, other effects. And they are required to do this on pain of death. Over 2 days, September 28th and September 29th, the Germans murder, with the help of Ukrainian militia who actually do the shooting, 33,773 Jews, men, women, and children, according to their own reports. Now, you're going to pardon me for sharing this image with you, but I want you to get a sense of what that means. All of us have been in a room with thousands of people, either a rock concert, a school convocation, a big football game, maybe not an Ivy League game, but a big football game. We've been in a space with 30 or 40,000 people. I go to Fenway Park once in a while, right? That's 40,000 people. Imagine you're sitting behind home plate and you're gazing at the bleachers all around you. 40,000 fellow human beings. What would it take to kill each of them in 2 days? How would you organize it? How would you control this enormous crowd? How would you separate the men from the women? Have them disrobe? Look for their valuables. People are screaming. They hear the shooting. After all, the Germans are not using silencers. They're using automatic weapons. This is what they did thousands of times from June 41 until they're thrown out in early of 1944. They only stopped to reload. Now, many scholars or, informed observers recall the conference in Wannsee, W-A-N-N-S-E-E, in Wannsee, outside of Berlin, in January of 1942, when the German High Command explains to the state bureaucracy their plans to round up the Jews of Europe and murder them. But by January of 1942, the Germans have already murdered about 1 million Jews in occupied Soviet territory. So all that has already taken place. The first people killed at Auschwitz with poison gas were Soviet POWs who were brought there in the fall of 1941 as an experiment to see if the idea worked. Treblinka was not created yet. Other concentration camps, other killing centers weren't even constructed yet by the time the Germans killed 1 million Jews in occupied Soviet territory. And this brutality took such a toll on German soldiers, not that I'm sympathetic, that there were units, 5, 10, 15%, that had to be withdrawn. That percentage of the men, because they were overcome with this gruesome work. Remember, these are soldiers, so of course they tend to be younger men. They have families of their own, young children of their own, and here they are, killing men, women, helpless men, women, and children, day after day. As far as we know, not a single soldier was punished for his inability to continue with that work. They were simply excused. Himmler himself, in September of 41, asked to watch a massacre. Was brought to Minsk, and they assembled 100 victims, just 100. He couldn't watch. He physically could not watch. So that's the scale of what the Germans were doing. And out of their concern for the well-being of the perpetrators, they devised an alternative method, a mobile gas van. A truck with a compartment in the back. You seal the compartment hermetically. You connect a pipe from the back of the exhaust pipe to the bottom of the compartment. You put 15, 20, 40 people in the back. You drive them 20 minutes or 30 minutes to a ravine. By the time they get there, they're asphyxiated. And the Germans thought this was a more humane alternative, obviously for the sake of the perpetrators. We believe they killed about 350,000 people in this way, in Soviet territory and in parts of Poland. Now there's a remarkable French priest, and some of you may have heard of Father Patrick Desbois. His book is Holocaust by Bullets. Father Desbois, a few years ago, assembled a group of researchers, a team of engineers, archaeologists, a videographer, and they began their project in Ukraine. Father Desbois is a Catholic priest. He wears a collar. And they would go to a village or a small town, a city. He would introduce himself to the local priests. And then he would explain why he's there, and he would ask to see their Jews. And the priest would take them on a walk. A kilometer, 3 kilometers, into the woods, to a field, to a ravine, and point to a pit, covered now, and say, well, here are our Jews. And then Father Desbois and his team would carefully survey the area, get a sense of how wide the pit is or was, how deep, and begin some very careful digging, and get an estimate of how many people are buried there. And in the course of this initial digging, they, of course, found a great deal of evidence. For example, they find bullet casings. And this is very important because the bullet casing lets you know who did the shooting. Was it a German army unit? Was it a police unit? Was it a Ukrainian militia? They all have different kinds of ammunition. And all that's right there, physical evidence. And every place they've gone, when they find corpses or remains, they find keys. After all, these are metal objects. They didn't have plastic keys then. They find keys. Why would they find keys? Because all these people, like us, when they left home that day, were carrying their keys, expecting at some point they're going back home. Every one of us, after all, is carrying a key in our pocket. To our home, to our dorm room, whatever it is. This is a very grim kind of work, and when he's finished at a particular site, they do try to fence it off and create some kind of marker and encourage the locals to have a proper monument. So Father Desbois estimates there are 2,000 such sites in Ukraine alone. Now, the Soviet Union was in a unique position in World War II. It was the only country occupied by the Germans where the national government remained in place and mounted a resistance. After all, many other countries were occupied. But once they occupied, there was a kind of surrender. They didn't then resist the Germans in the name of the national government. There may have been people working underground, but not in the name of the national government. But the Soviet Union did, of course, mount a resistance. That was the Red Army. Moscow was not captured. The Kremlin was not captured. And the partisans that operated behind German lines. And many Jews were part of that resistance. Because Jews were still had a large group of living in the Soviet Union and were very heavily involved in Soviet cultural institutions, industrial institutions, newspapers, and Stalin, over the winter of 1941-42, organized 5 anti-fascist committees to appeal to that particular constituency in the West to support the war effort, the joint war effort, the alliance against Hitler. So there was an anti-fascist committee of women, of Slavs. There were large Slavic communities in Canada and America, of scientists, of young people, and of Jews, the Jewish anti-fascist committee. And these were made up, the Jewish anti-fascist committee was led by many renowned cultural figures. The chair was a man named Solomon Michoels, who was the director and leading actor of the Jewish State Theater, a Yiddish language state theater supported by the Soviet government in Moscow. Yiddish poets and novelists, David Bergelson, Itzik Pfeffer, Leib Kvitko, David Hofstein. The violinist David Oistrakh was part of it, a name perhaps some of you are familiar with. Journalists like Ilya Ehrenburg and Vasily Grossman were part of the committee. And the committee generated thousands and thousands of articles and poems and interviews and accounts of German atrocities directed against Jews, and sent that material to the West to support the effort against Hitler, and published accounts in the Soviet press, both in Yiddish language. There was a Yiddish language newspaper created during the war under the auspices of the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee called Einigkeit, Unity. And that was in Yiddish. And then occasionally, Ehrenburg especially, was able to place articles about the atrocities in the Central Soviet press, in Pravda, particularly, and in Red Star, Krasnaya Zvezda, which was the most important newspaper during the war. It was the paper for the Red Army. So to say, looking back, that the Soviet government systematically and studiously ignored the murder of its own citizens on Soviet territory, its Jewish citizens, is not true. It's a very inconsistent record, not necessarily a proud record, but there were headline articles in Izvestia and Pravda outlining very explicitly that the Germans were trying to murder every Jew in Europe. And in my book, The Unknown Black Book, and the research I did, the dates are right there. And you can go to the library and find those articles on your own. There's no secret about them. So I emphasize that because the Jews played a role in the Soviet media and the Soviet government in opposing Hitler as Jews and as Soviet citizens, as Soviet patriots, as Soviet officials. Let me give you 2 or 3 examples. There was a man in Moscow named Solomon Abramovich Lazovsky, Jewish background. He had come to know Lenin and Stalin early in the 20th century. He's mentioned in John Reed's book, 10 Days That Shook the World. When Bertrand Russell came to Petrograd in 1919, 1920, it was Lazovsky's job to shepherd him around. And during World War II, Lazovsky was the deputy foreign minister. And he supervised all the anti-fascist committees. When Goebbels would say something ugly about Stalin, which was a habit Goebbels had, it was Lazovsky's job to respond in the Soviet press because it was part of Lazovsky's job to work with the Western correspondents in Moscow. And when you look at Goebbels' diary, you see these references, Der Jude Lazovsky, because he was paying attention to what Lazovsky would say. When General Paulus surrendered at Stalingrad in February of 1943, he surrendered to a Soviet Jewish colonel, Leonid Vinokur. By that time, Paulus was barely physically able to stand up under the pressure, under disease. And Vinokur was a big, brawny Soviet Jew. So that was quite intimidating to the Germans. And the most important journalists in the Soviet press were, in fact, Ehrenburg and Grossman. Hitler said if he captured Moscow, he would hang Ehrenburg in Red Square, along with Stalin and Shostakovich. Grossman spent 500 days at the front, straight days, with the Red Army. He did all the principal reporting on the Battle of Stalingrad and was withdrawn on the eve of victory Well, Stalin preferred having a Russian journalist report on the victory, not someone named Grossman. So he sent Konstantin Simonov, obviously a Russian journalist, to report on the actual victory itself. But everybody knew that it was Grossman's reporting on the battle that was informing the Soviet public of what was going on. So without question, they were the two most important journalists in the Soviet press during the war, and each in their own way tried to report on what was happening to their fellow Jews in the Soviet press, in the Russian language Soviet press. Well, let me say one more thing about the Anti-Fascist Committee. In the spring of 1943, at the height of the war, in the months after the Stalingrad, Stalin sent Michoels and Itzik Pfeffer, a Yiddish poet who was a member of the Communist Party, to the West, to America, to Mexico, to Canada, and they stopped in England on the way back. They were out of the country 7 or 8 months. Imagine, to fly from the Soviet Union to New York, they had to fly over the Middle East to Africa, from Africa to Latin America, and then up north to North America. Because you couldn't, there were no commercial airline flights at that time over Western Europe. Right? You couldn't make a connection in Frankfurt. They actually flew over Palestine. Michoels made a note of that when he later wrote about it. They were here for a better part of 6 months in the US itself. They were in New York, Chicago, Los Angeles. They saw many leading cultural figures. They saw, there's a picture we have of Michoels and Pfeffer with Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia. And LaGuardia spoke Yiddish to them. Anyone know why? This Italian gentleman? Because his mother was Jewish. He was raised speaking Yiddish. He was a Republican. In those days, we had liberal Republicans. He was an ally of Roosevelt. It's a genus of politicians that has disappeared, of course. But LaGuardia was a major figure, and he spoke to them in Yiddish. And he welcomed them at the Polo Grounds on the night of July 8th, the largest pro-Soviet rally in the history of the United States, not organized by the Communist Party, organized by the Jewish community in New York, to welcome these two Soviet Jewish envoys to the Polo Grounds. Very emotional welcome, because the Red Army is now triumphant. It's clear the Allies will win the war, though there's terrible fighting still for 2 more years. And by the summer of '43, the West is aware of the magnitude of the Holocaust, beginning to be really aware of what's going on. So Michoels and Pfeffer are representatives of a country occupied by the Soviet Union, bearing the brunt of the fighting, suffering the murder of its Jewish citizens and others. And so they're welcomed with deep, deep emotion. Michoels and Pfeffer returned the beginning of December to Moscow, and they're returning to a different country. Now the Wehrmacht is being pushed out of Soviet territory. Ehrenburg has arranged 24 journalists, Jewish and non-Jewish, to follow the Wehrmacht, to follow the Red Army into liberated territory. Ukraine, Belarusia, the Baltic states, find the massacre sites, find survivors, find documents. Let's confirm what they did. Fresh evidence. And they intend to create a book called the Black Book about German atrocities on Soviet territory. The history of the Black Book is quite complicated, but in the end, Stalin forbids its publication. The material is compiled. Some of it is sent to Nuremberg in 1946, where Soviet prosecutors presented during the International Military Tribunal, the first trial. But the book itself is banned. It's later used, the manuscript, the material is used as evidence against members of the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee at their secret trial in 1952. So the material in the Black Book is used at 2 trials. It's used against German criminals, war criminals, and it's used against the Jews who compiled it by Soviet officials. Now, I'd like to close with a little bit about how all this was handled at Nuremberg. Nuremberg is, of course, I'm a champion of Nuremberg, is a signal event in the post-war period. there was a big debate among the Allies what to do with the German leaders. They had warned them that they would be held accountable. But what did that mean? So beginning in 1944, representatives of the Soviet Union, Britain, America, and the Free French begin discussions. What does it mean to hold the Germans accountable? Churchill floats the idea, it's hard to say how serious he was, that they should take 50,000 SS officers and put them against the wall. And just summarily execute 50,000 SS officers. But in the end, the American proposal wins out. The leader of our delegation is the Associate Justice of the Supreme Court, Robert Jackson. And the idea is there will be trials, open trials of German officials. And the first trial opens in the fall of 1945, just months after the end of the war in Europe. Now, Nuremberg is a whole chapter of history, and obviously we're not going to get into great detail here, but I want to talk a little bit about the first trial, the International Military Tribunal, and then the trial of the Einsatzgruppen and commanders. Only one trial at Nuremberg involves all four powers. That's the International Military Tribunal, the first trial, where Rudolf Hess, Hermann Goering, Ribbentrop, Keitel of the army are brought to justice. That's the only trial where you have judges and prosecutors from the United States, the Soviet Union, Great Britain, and France. The major indictment of that trial concerns waging aggressive war. The atrocities we're concerned about today and what we call now the Holocaust was a secondary issue at the International Military Tribunal. Justice Jackson highlighted it in his opening speech, which is one of the great speeches and very easy to find, and I urge you to read it. And there were hundreds of pieces of evidence were presented about it, but it was still a secondary issue. But I'll mention three things that happened during the trial that relate directly to our talk today. First, at the end of November 1945, the U.S. Army Signal Corps presented a film based on film the Germans assembled of the concentration camps and the killing centers. Very gruesome, explicit imagery we've all seen in various documentary films. This was extremely upsetting to the defendants, Goering and Hess and Keitel, because they had been saying all this talk is rumors and exaggeration, and then here it was in black and white. That was very upsetting. Secondly, a German officer named Otto Ohlendorf testified for the prosecution. He had been a commander of Einsatzgruppen D in the southern area in Crimea, and he described and admitted that he had supervised the murder of 90,000 Jews and how they did it. And while he testified at Nuremberg, Goering was swearing at him from the defendant's dock. And then thirdly, in February of 1946, when the Soviet prosecution had its turn, Soviet prosecutors brought 3 survivors. They were the only survivors to testify. It was Soviet prosecutors who brought them. They brought a woman from the Warsaw Ghetto, a man who was among the handful of survivors of Treblinka, and they brought a Yiddish poet, a hero of the Vilna Ghetto, Avram Sutzkever, who only recently died at the age of like 93 in Tel Aviv. This was covered in the Soviet press. There were books about it, that these Jews were testifying at Nuremberg at the behest of Soviet prosecutors. Sutzkever was then soon after allowed to leave for Palestine and Israel, of course, and he lived out his life. There was a very famous and accomplished poet, but he had led the underground fighters in the Vilna Ghetto. A little story about Sutzkever. Sutzkever was brought from Lithuania after its liberation to Moscow on Stalin's personal orders. He befriended members of the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee. He was especially close to Ehrenburg. He testified at Nuremberg at Ehrenburg's suggestion, And we believe that Sutzinger had an idea of smuggling a gun into the Palace of Justice to assassinate Goering. But Ehrenburg got wind of it and convinced him he shouldn't do it because the American guards would be forced to kill him, the shooter. Now, at that time, there was an investigator in Berlin, an American investigator, a very remarkable guy named Benjamin Ferencz, F-E-R-E-N-C-Z. He's still alive today in New Rochelle. He's about 90, 91 years old. Sharp as a tack. Ben Ferencz was a refugee Jewish immigrant from Hungary, went to New York as a young boy, studied at City College, Harvard Law School, and then was immediately drafted into the Army. He was in Patton's Army, was awarded 5 battle stars. At the end of the war, he became an investigator for the U.S. Army, investigating German war crimes against U.S. airmen. You know, a plane would be shot down, the pilot would parachute, and the Germans would kill him. So it was his job to dig up the body, figure out what happened, and find the killers. On a farm, maybe it was the farmers, maybe it was somebody else. That was his job. Telford Taylor, who was working with Robert Jackson, learned about Ferencz and got him into his unit as a researcher for Nuremberg. So he had an office in Berlin, researching out German atrocities. And one day, a colleague comes to Ferencz with a whole sheaf of papers. He says, Ben, you got to read these. So Ferencz looks at these papers and he realizes he's reading reports from the field from the Einsatzgruppe to their superiors in Berlin about their work. We reached Vilna, we killed 500 this morning. We were in Grodno, we killed 4,000. We were at Babi Yar this week, we killed 33,773 Jews. So Ferencz sat down at a desk, took an adding machine, page by page, kept track of the reports, and as he told me when I interviewed him, he stopped when he got to 1 million. So he took these Einsatzgruppen reports. This is all mimeograph material. These were cables. Remember, there's no internet. They couldn't use regular mail. They're in a war zone. These are cables. And he takes it to Telford Taylor and said, we got to go after these guys. And Taylor says, you know, Ben, we're planning 18 trials. We don't have the budget. We don't have the personnel. How are we going to do it? But Ferencz convinced him that he would lead the prosecution. Ferencz was was about 26 years old. He's a graduate of Harvard Law School, had never been in a courtroom. Right? In 1947, this trial opened. Ferencz got his way. In the end, there were 12 trials at Nuremberg. The International Military Tribunal, plus 11 others, of bankers, of industrialists, of doctors, SS generals, categories of Germans in the military and society that were responsible for the war and the atrocities. These subsequent trials were not joint trials by the 4 powers. For the most part, they were controlled by the Americans. So in 1947, the trial the Einsatzgruppen commanders opened. Ferencz is the prosecutor. The prosecution lasts for a day and a half. He simply presents their own documents in their own words with their own, facsimile signatures on the cables. And then for several more months, the defense has its turn. And these generals, they're almost all generals, describe their work, defend themselves. Ohlendorf again testifies. He admits that he killed 90,000 people. But he pleads not guilty. Why? Because he was following orders. He took a pledge to carry out the orders of the Fuhrer. Whatever the Fuhrer said was law. And he was just following the law in Germany as it was then understood, as it was then constituted. Judge Busmano was an American judge from Pittsburgh, was completely flummoxed by this. Here's a man admitting to killing 90,000 people and pleading not guilty. So he questions Ohlendorf. He said, well, what does this mean? Anything the Fuhrer says you'll do and it's legal. What if he said, murder your sister? Would you do it? Would it be legal? And Ohlendorf didn't know. He couldn't answer. Another of the defendants claims that he was simply at a dental appointment in Berlin on the day of the massacre, where his own signature appeared. Several defendants claimed that they really tried to carry out the massacres in a humane fashion. They wouldn't allow their men to shoot for more than an hour or two at a time. This is their definition of humanely killing people. Now, there are several things that are unique about this trial. I believe there are 24 defendants initially. 14 are sentenced to death in April of 1948, more than in any other trial at Nuremberg. But this trial ends in the spring of 1948, so do your math. The war ends in the spring of 45. 3 years have passed. The world is changing. Europe is changing. We have a new war, a new conflict emerging, the Cold War. The Allies, the Americans, are thinking, what are we going to do about Germany? Germany's divided into zones. We have our Germans, the Russians have their Germans. We're going to divide Germany, obviously. I think it was François Mauriac, the French writer, said, we love Germany so much, we want to see two of them. So there's discussion of what's going to happen with this new West Germany, the Federal Republic of Germany. Should it be armed? You know, the Bundeswehr, now the German army, post-war army. Become part of NATO, this emerging alliance. So there's a lot of pressure on the Americans not to carry out these executions. And this is one of many trials where the defendants have been sentenced to death, but the executions have not been carried out. If I remember correctly, there are about 75 defendants who are awaiting execution. German churches are circulating petitions asking for clemency. They go to the Americans and they remind the Americans of Abraham Lincoln's words at the end of the Civil War. With malice toward none, with charity for all. Shouldn't that apply to us Germans? Even Winston Churchill, who had said we should execute 50,000 summarily, Churchill makes a contribution to the defense fund of General Erich von Manstein, the most accomplished field commander on the German side, a man profoundly respected by his enemies in the British Army. You know, because the myth was, yes, the Wehrmacht fought, but it was the SS who murdered, which wasn't true. The SS and the Einsatzgruppen could not have carried out the massacres without the full cooperation of German army units. All of this has been confirmed now through documentary evidence. Von Manstein worked with Einsatzgruppen D in the Crimea and Ohlendorf to carry out the massacres there. Von Manstein was not a defendant in this trial, but he was a defendant in a different trial. Not at Nuremberg, but elsewhere. Churchill makes a contribution to his defense. The Americans don't know what to do in this atmosphere. The U.S. High Commissioner for Germany is General Lucius Clay. He retires, comes back to America. He's replaced by a lawyer named John J. McCloy. McCloy was the quintessential American corporate lawyer. He was a partner in Cadwallader, Wickersham, and Taft, the longest-standing American law firm, still exists on Wall Street, goes back to the end of the 18th century. McCloy had served as Undersecretary of War during World War II. So McCloy is sent to Germany as U.S. High Commissioner, and these cases end up in his lap. And he didn't know what to do. McCloy summons Judge Peck, the head of the New York State Court of Appeals, our highest court here in New York, to lead an advisory panel what to do with these defendants. They don't read the transcript. Benjamin Ferencz is in Germany. He offers to see them. They refuse to see him. They do their review and they issue a report to McCloy, and you can see their suggestions where there's some adjustments in terms of who should get executed, who should get life, etc. Then McCloy takes this material to Truman's White House. Truman's the president now, Roosevelt is dead. And they make further adjustments. This becomes known that the U.S. is reviewing the sentences, not just this trial, but all these other 10, 11 other trials where you have dozens of people sentenced to death. Krupp was convicted at a different trial, the head of the German arms factories and other plants, and he was sentenced to many years in prison, and his property, his companies were confiscated. So they had to review that sentence. And Telford Taylor gets wind of it, Eleanor Roosevelt gets wind of it, they object. Mrs. Roosevelt publicly says, why are we commuting the sentences of German war criminals? The New York Times comments that this is the triumph of expediency over justice. In the end, in June 1951, only 4 of these 14 defendants are executed, including Ernest Blobel, who commanded the units at Babi Yar, and Ohlendorf is executed, and 2 others. The rest have either lengthy prison terms or shorter prison terms. By August of 1958, all the remaining surviving defendants are released, in spite of what their original sentence was, and in some cases, in spite of what the revised sentence was. So barely 10 years after the trial, the indictment read for the murder of 1 million people. It was the largest murder trial in history. By August of 1958, all the surviving defendants had been released. Keep in mind, this trial was entirely in the hands of the Americans. They were held in Landsberg prison, not Spandau in Berlin, completely under the control of American officers. When the final defendant was released, Martin Sandberger, in August of 1951, the New York Times reported on his release in a small article inside the front section. And they commented, yes, he and the other defendants had been convicted of the murder of hundreds, that's the number they used, hundreds of Jews. Remember, the indictment read 1 million. We know now that they contributed to the murder of 2.5 million. So it's very sobering to understand how quickly the Allies were overcome with moral amnesia. And it also is sobering to understand how much moral resilience you need to deal with criminals of this kind, which is a lesson we have today. When we look at Rwanda or former Yugoslavia, why was Idi Amin allowed to live out the rest of his life peacefully in Saudi Arabia when he was thrown out of Uganda? Or the various assorted officers from Haiti who got refuge in the Panama canals in Panama or Miami? I have a colleague at Human Rights Watch who recently said, dealing with international justice issues, if you kill 1 person, you go to jail. If you kill 10 people, you go to a mental asylum. If you kill 1,000 people, you get amnesty. Only government officials can carry out the murder of thousands and thousands of people. Do we have a system in place? Do we have the moral resilience to deal with those criminals? When you think of Darfur, when you think of Rwanda, when you think of Yugoslavia, or more mundane examples like Haiti, and all that's happened in Haiti over the decades, including Duvalier and his successors, and all the other examples you can think of. Do we?
What about Vietnam?
Let me answer your question more broadly. There are now at least 3 dozen or more examples of what we call transitional justice, where more democratic governments that have replaced more dictatorial governments, more authoritarian governments, like Argentina, South Africa, Uruguay, Brazil, there are many, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, I mean, it just goes on and on. Who then, there's a more democratic government in place, they get the files, what do you do with those officials? And each of these examples is different, from truth commissions to trials, as there were in Greece, after the Greek colonel's regime collapsed in 1974, I believe. They had trials, regular, ordinary trials for kidnapping and assault and murder, because after all, these are crimes under ordinary Greek law, as they are in any society. And that applies, the example you cite, and there are other examples now, Obama administration dealing or not dealing with the use of torture by Bush administration officials. These can be very difficult, divisive questions, and each society has to step up to the plate, or pardon the sports metaphor, but has to step up to the plate and figure out on its own what's it going to do. In our society, accountability is not our strong suit, is it? There's this feeling, well, the election is the moment of accountability. You lose the election, you've been held accountable. And that's what Bush said in 2004. This is an accountability moment. He won the election, so everything's hunky-dory. The Republicans lost the election in 2008. That's the accountability, not law, just when you lose the election. Is that really morally ethical, even legally ethical? Well, that's how we kind of sort things out here.
You seem to suggest that Stalin was friendly with the Jews, and certainly Jews that were in positions, you know,
yes,
intellectuals, but what happened at some point that he
well, I'm not suggesting he was friendly with them. Stalin's not known to have many friends, but there were Jews in the bureaucracy, Jews in the Communist Party, Jews in the Bolshoi and Pravda and Red Star, who had very responsible positions, and he allowed them to do their work. In fact, after the victory at Stalingrad, and it's a complicated story, the Soviets began to purge their institutions of Jews. So the leaders of the Bolshoi, leading editors of newspapers, were in fact demoted. They weren't arrested, but they were demoted. Part of the reason seems to be, there's this story that Hitler was distributing leaflets at the front, the Soviet soldiers, that, you know, they were fighting for Jews. Because there are all these Jews in these various responsible positions. And this was brought to Stalin's attention. And he said, well, we should do something about it. So I'll just give you one example. Ehrenburg's daughter, Irina, was a frontline war correspondent for a small newspaper called Unичтожим врага, We Will Destroy the Enemy. And one fine day, a Soviet colonel came into the office of this paper, he looked around, and he said in Russian, what have we got here, a synagogue, a synagoga? Because they were all Jews, or mostly all Jews. So the paper was broken up. The most important editor at Red Star at the height of the war was David Ortenberg, obviously Jewish. And at one point he was called into the Kremlin and said, look, you have too many Jewish correspondents. You got to get rid of them. He said, fine, we already have. And he named 10 or 12 who had been killed at the front. And he walked out. So there was tremendous pressure on Jews in the bureaucracy after Stalingrad to be withdrawn from those very visible positions. Because Stalin felt, for some reason, from a propaganda point of view, vulnerable. And also, this emphasis on Jewish suffering wasn't important anymore. They were winning. The Americans had sent Lend-Lease. The Americans were going to invade in June in '44. You know, it was, the war was shifting, the priorities were shifting. So I don't want to give the impression that, you know, he was just, you know, these were his best buddies. No, they were Soviet patriots. They were very capable people, and he relied on them. I mean, there are so many these anecdotes. When Stalin and Molotov signed the non-aggression pact in at the end of August 1939, So Kaganovich is in the room with Ribbentrop. Now Kaganovich was a Jewish member of the Politburo. And Stalin made a toast to Kaganovich, which the Germans had to join. And the Germans suggested that Stalin purge his high ranks of Jews. And he responded, it's too early. I don't have people to replace them.
A question about some of these war criminals who are released from prison. And I know in the cases of some of the Ukrainian and Belarusian collaborators, for instance, that they had relationships sometimes with U.S. intelligence. With U.S. intelligence and,
Yeah.
and kind of anti-Bolshevik movements, right?
Yeah.
Or in anti-Bolshevik institutions. And I was wondering, if you see with any of these German figures, right, if they have some kind of if they have some kind of relationship with the post-war state, right, or post-war military.
Well, you raised many questions. These societies have had their own difficulty dealing with this history. Even today, since the breakup of the Soviet Union, Lithuania, Ukraine, Latvia are now independent states. They're very proud of their independence, proud of their history. But to sort out that history is pretty complicated because they were the site and their own citizens were murdered. Jews were murdered, often by Ukrainians and Lithuanians. At the same time, there were Lithuanians resisting Soviet occupation into the post-war period. And so how do you sort out you celebrate them because they're in favor of Ukrainian independence, Lithuanian independence, and yet during the war they were collaborating with the Germans in the murder of Jews. How do you sort that out? How do you give all these narratives a coherence? And unfortunately, some of these societies, in many ways, are failing. I refer you to very fine work of a Yale scholar who's writing about this, Timothy Snyder. His latest book is Bloodlands. He's had a couple of major essays in the New York Review just on this particular theme. In terms of U.S. and post-war contacts, well, of course, we brought a lot of German scientists here and kind of ignored what they'd been doing in terms of slave labor programs. And maybe you remember Tom Lehrer's famous song about Werner von Braun and the ICBMs. It's my job to send the missiles up. Who cares where they come down? Mocking his moral sensibility. And then, yes, there were German officers, including some of these guys on your list, who thought that because of their intelligence backgrounds that the Allies would want to work with them. That they would surrender the British and the Americans and they would be hired because of their intelligence capacities in this new conflict against the Soviets. And they really thought so. And don't think there aren't examples of people we used. There are examples. But thank you all for coming out today.